My name is Richard LeBaron. I'm a senior fellow at the Rafik Hariri Center for the Middle East at the Atlantic Council. And I'm pleased today to have with us for a MENASource discussion Professor Greg Gause, who is a professor at the University of Political Science at the University of Vermont, as well as a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Doha Center. And Greg is one of the premier experts on the Arabian or the Persian Gulf, or whatever you want to label it, according to your politics and your location. But he has been a long-time expert on the Persian Gulf and the countries of the GCC, has lived in those countries, has written about them, including a very good book called The International Relations of the Persian Gulf, published a couple of years ago, and recently published a long monograph entitled Kings for All Seasons, How the Middle East Monarchies Survived the Arab Spring. There's so much to talk about, Greg, and so many ways to approach Gulf security, but let me start, just by observing. Last Thursday, the Secretary of State and Secretary Hagel of Defense met with the GCC foreign ministers and the Secretary General of the GCC at the UN for one of the meetings of what they call now the U.S. Gulf U.S. Gulf Strategic Cooperation Forum. And as far as I can tell, this meeting made almost no news. It was overshadowed by Secretary Kerry's meeting with the Iranian foreign minister in the context of the nuclear talks, and by the announcements regarding an agreement on Syrian chemical weapons. In some ways, it's indicative of the relationship between the U.S. and the Gulf that it doesn't make a lot of news. As you have qualified it in some ways, it's sort of a status quo situation that doesn't tend to change quickly. The dynamics are fairly stable. But I think, that may be some of the good news, but I think there are some challenges there. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about those challenges and some of the attributes of that relationship. Maybe we could start with, Iran. Of course, Iran has been the sort of determining factor in the buildup of defenses in the Gulf over the last several years. How do you see this unfolding? Should a process of negotiation actually result in some sort of workable agreement with the Iranians? How does that diminish, or how could that change the nature of the security relationship between the United States and our Gulf partners?
I think that the most important thing when we talk about the relationship between Iran, the Gulf monarchies, and the United States in the security atmosphere, security context of the Gulf, is that there's always an enormous capacity for exaggeration among the Gulf states about United States intentions and motivations toward Iran. And I think that this is understandable given the fact that the Gulf states are relatively weak states militarily. They rely on the United States for their security in many, many ways. And so they're afraid of two things, right? They're afraid of America dragging them into a war with Iran when America is bellicose toward Iran. And they're afraid that when the United States is talking with Iran, that their interests are going to be sacrificed. I mean, this is a structural situation. There's no policy way to avoid this, right? This is exactly, I would argue this is very analogous to the way the Western European NATO allies felt about the United States in the Cold War in its relations with the Soviet Union. When the US and the Soviets were at daggers drawn, the Western Europeans were afraid that they would get dragged into a war that would be fought on their soil. When the United States and the Soviets in periods of détente were talking, the Western Europeans were afraid that we were selling them out. This is exactly the situation with the Gulf. So there's no solution to it. It seems to me that the policy recommendation that comes out of this for the U.S. government is just keep the Gulf states informed and hope for the best, because I think that at the elite levels in the Gulf there's a bit more understanding of these things than at the at the chattering class level in the Gulf, which either sees the U.S. selling them out to Iran or sees the U.S. dragging them into a war with Iran every other week. So I think that this is just a situation that has to be managed. It's not it's not a problem that can be solved.
In a sense, our security policy has been driven by two elements in recent years in the Gulf, and one is oil, an enduring interest, and the other is Iran. With the diminishing dependence of the U.S. on oil from that part of the world, and with the possibility of an outbreak of lack of hostilities between Iran and the U.S., that could create a sort of an environment where some of these notions of the U.S. withdrawing from the Gulf sort of get some traction in both elite circles, and it could actually, due to diminishing defense budgets in the United States, actually could get some traction here if we see less of a threat in that region. I don't know if we can predict that that sort of a situation is going to occur, but we certainly can't rule it out.
You know, I think you're right about that. I mean, the United States is going to be reassessing its security commitments all over the globe over the coming years because of resource constraints. But that being said, it does seem to me that the Persian Gulf region is still an area that the United States policymakers view as vital to the world economy and to the world strategic picture. I think we have to remember that the American commitment to this region predated a specific American reliance on the oil of the Persian Gulf. While we were still producing, almost all of our own domestic needs in the 50s and in the 60s, the United States still had a commitment to the politics of that region. Now, partially that was Cold War, but partially it was driven by, I think, a strategic understanding that oil is a global commodity, and that the world oil market is a single bathtub. And just because the United States gets oil from Canada and Mexico and is developing its own oil resources and shale gas and all these things that might lessen the American imported energy bill, that doesn't mean that what happens in the Persian Gulf isn't going to affect the world economy. If there's disruption of oil supply from the Persian Gulf, those nice people in Canada and Mexico aren't going to forego the profits they can make from the price increases because they like America so much. It's a single market, and the effects of supply shutoffs or supply disruptions anywhere ripple through the price mechanism of that market in a matter of nanoseconds these days. So just because we're not importing from the Gulf doesn't mean the Gulf isn't still a centrally important part of the world energy market.
You make a good point, and I'm glad you made the historical point that we haven't always been out there because of our own reliance on that energy, but partly because of world reliance. I wonder, one of the things that does seem to me to be different, new and different, is the real qualitative and quantitative increase in the weaponry and the defense assets of places like Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Qatar. This seems to be a quantum jump over the last 5 or 6 years, and I wonder when can we say, well, what is their role? I mean, it seems to me, some people have said that the UAE Air Force right now could easily take on the Iranian Air Force. So what are we defending against at this point in the Gulf, and what is it that they really can't do that we can, other than come to their aid in the case of a sustained ground war?
Mm-hmm. Well, let's hope we don't have to test that UAE versus Iran Air Force matchup anytime soon. Richard, you make a great point. What are these states defending against? I think that the acquisition of sophisticated and advanced arms is not only a product of a rational calculation of defense needs. I think that's true in our own country, where we see the Congress approving weapons systems that the Pentagon itself says it doesn't need. And I think that it's also true everywhere else in the world. I think that it's particularly true in the Gulf states, where for the last 10 years you've seen an enormous run-up in the price of oil, and thus the constraints, the budget constraints that other places feel, and that the Gulf states themselves felt back in the 90s and the early 2000s when oil prices were lower, are removed. And so you got bureaucratic politics, you've got personal enrichment, you've got all these factors, that prestige, that factor in. So what's the big threat? I think that if you're any one of those states in the Gulf, the big threat to you is internal instability exploited by outside powers. And that is the biggest threat to your own regime's security. The idea that the Iranians are going to launch a land war or an amphibious attack or an air attack on any of the Gulf states is a really low probability. And the idea that Iraq is going to be in a position to do that anytime soon is a really low probability. So why do you need all of these weapons, and why is the U.S. there? I think it's just fundamental deterrence. Right? Even if it's a low probability, it's not a zero probability, as the Kuwaitis found out in 1990. And thus, if the United States is willing, for its own purposes, to sustain a defense presence and defense agreements with you, your countries of the GCC, at a cost that's acceptable to you, why not do it? Because it takes that really, really small chance of an outside attack down basically to zero. And then you do what the U.S. is not good at, is helping you with your internal security. And there you've got a deal. You've got a deal on your own.
Greg, you in your book, you talk about the importance of Iraq as part of the equation in Gulf security. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit in the sense of where Iraq is now and where it might be over the next several years. I mean, at one point it was strategic depth for the Gulf. At one point it was a strange sort of threat for them. Now it's a sort of a caught up in sectarian politics to some degree. You know, here in the United States, we sort of turned our eyes away from Iraq, sort of shamelessly. But they haven't in the Gulf, I'm confident, and I just wonder, how do you see the Iraq card playing in Gulf security over the next several years?
Right. Well, Iraq really is the hole in the Gulf donut. You know, before, under the Ba'ath, Iraq was a balance against Iranian power, and the Gulf states could play kind of in between those two. You know, leaning toward Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War, looking to improve relations with Iran right after the Gulf War. But the Gulf states could play in between the two big Gulf region powers. Now the Gulf monarchies can't do that. Iraq is firmly within, or at least the Iraqi government in Baghdad is firmly within the Iranian orbit. I think that the Gulf states have been less than creative in how they've dealt with Iraq. You know, I don't think it was inevitable that the Iraqi government would fall under the sway of the Iranians, but it has. And the Gulf states see that and sometimes exaggerate it. So they see themselves as now confronted with an Iranian-Iraqi common front, right, that's looking to extend its influence into the Gulf states and perhaps even destabilize them. Bahrain is the kind of case in point. The Bahraini government vastly exaggerates the role of outside powers in the current instability and political conflict within Bahrain. But I think that the leadership believes that there are outside forces that are trying to undermine them. And the other Gulf states don't face the same situation Bahrain does, but you hear the same kind of talk from them about efforts by the Iranians to infiltrate their domestic politics, and thus it seems to me that that's how they define their most immediate threat right now.
Greg, I'd be interested in your views on Bahrain. I read your recent paper, and you characterized the issue for the United States as not really about democratization or protection of human rights in Bahrain, but rather as protection of U.S. interests. And the calculation that we need to make is whether it's worth it to be in a place where there's the threat of instability or there is actual instability, which brings a certain danger to our forces and uncertainty to our ability to operate there. But you know, I have to confess, I don't see any thaw in the political stalemate, and if anything, I see this thing getting a little bit worse, with lines being drawn very starkly, repressive measures being taken. I mean, are we approaching the point where this, as you call it, this nagging toothache is just not worth putting up with anymore?
I think that that's something that we, as in the United States, our policymakers have to think about, because there are a couple of things about Bahrain. I don't see an exit ramp for the current Bahraini political stalemate unless there's a Saudi-Iranian understanding more generally in the Gulf. If there's a Saudi-Iranian understanding, then the Saudis can push the Bahraini government, the Iranians can talk to Shia groups within Bahrain, and you might find some place where you can have some kind of, even if temporarily stable, political equilibrium. But without that regional understanding, I just don't see that happening in Bahrain. So that's one. Two, the United States has this large naval base in Bahrain. We've had a naval presence there since World War II. It's gotten much larger since the Gulf War of 1990-91. It's an essential part of the American military infrastructure in Bahrain. And interestingly, throughout all the upheavals of the mid-2000s in Bahrain, of the mid-1990s, and of the current really serious, most serious political crisis in Bahrain, I can't recall a single attack on the American facility there. And so there's not an immediate threat to the American presence. But the longer this goes on in Bahrain, it just seems to me inevitable that the American presence is going to be drawn into this domestic conflict. I mean, the past history of military bases in the Middle East, mostly British, but some American, isn't a happy one. These bases have frequently become, in the past, the lightning rods of political discontent. And I can't imagine that if the current situation in Bahrain continues, that's not going to happen. And we have that base there not to protect the Bahraini regime. It's useless for protecting the Bahraini regime. Naval forces cannot protect the Bahraini regime from its own people. We're going to have to try to think about alternative arrangements, because if Bahraini instability spills over into the ability of the American forces there to fulfill their larger mission about security issues in the Gulf, then it's a liability to have the base there. And I think that that's something that we at least have to plan for.
You know, we've talked a lot in the past about the seeming inability of the United States and our major Gulf partners to reach some common ground in treating some regional issues, including Syria and Egypt. I don't think we're making much progress on that. I see, you know, great disappointment among the Gulf leadership about our inaction in Syria and basically taking U.S. military force off the table, I would say, and serious disagreement about the situation in Egypt. I just wonder, you know, we at the Atlantic Council, you know, one of our goals has been to try to find that space where we can strengthen the partnership between our major Gulf allies and the United States. but I'm somewhat discouraged by recent experience, and I don't know whether it's a matter of just different priorities, different values, different fears. But I wonder if you share my discouragement, or you think there's something that's a ray of hope out there.
Well, I don't disagree with your analysis, but I'm not as discouraged as you are, because I never saw the U.S. relationship with the Gulf states as being based upon a common agenda on regional politics. We've had a lot of differences with Saudi Arabia. Let's focus on Saudi as the most important of those players. We've had a lot of differences with Saudi Arabia on regional politics in our history. Most spectacularly, the oil embargo of 1973 over Arab-Israeli issues. It's uncomfortable, I guess, for the United States and Saudi Arabia to have such different goals on Egypt, to not so much have different goals, but care so differently about Syria. And I think that that's the key thing about Syria, is that the Saudis care a lot about Syria, and we don't care that much about Syria. And frankly, I agree with the position that the United States shouldn't care that much about Syria. I don't think it's that important. I certainly don't think it's so important that we should be using military forces there. But for the Saudis, it's really important. This is just something that we're going to have to live with. The Saudis are going to have to live with, and the relationship has experienced these kinds of differences in priorities, and even really conflicting policy priorities in the past. The bedrock, it seems to me, is the bilateral security arrangement, which the Saudis might wish they had an alternative patron, and they might be hoping that someday China will play that role. But they know that that's not there yet. And so it's a Catholic marriage. I've always thought that our relationship with these states is basically a Catholic marriage, the old-fashioned Catholic marriage, no divorce. Even if you are really mad at your partner, even if you and your partner have grown apart on a whole number of issues, you know you're fated to have to live together. And I think that absent some huge geopolitical change in the region, or some huge change technologically in the way energy is produced and consumed, we're fated that way. This brings us kind of around to that first question you asked about the outreach to Iran and how the Gulf states feel about that. It seems to me that American interests in the Persian Gulf region have always been to prevent any other power besides the United States from having a dominant role there. Thus, even if our relations with Iran improve, we're still going to want to have relations with the Gulf states. We're not going to want to turn the Gulf over to Iran, even when we trusted the Iranian regime enormously during the days of the Shah. We still maintained good relations with the states on the Arab side of the Gulf. We still had a strong security relationship with Saudi Arabia. There are a lot of reasons for that. American oil companies operating there, but the basic strategic imperative of not seeing any one power dominate the Gulf, I think, has animated American policy in that region for some time. It's the reason that we fought the Gulf War in 1990-91. It's the reason that the Clinton administration pursued dual containment. It's the reason that the United States has sustained its military presence in that region since that time. I think the Iraq War is a whole different kettle of fish. I think we fought that for a lot of different reasons. But I think now we're getting back to that kind of fundamental, basic American policy of preserving a Gulf geostrategic picture in which no other actor plays the single hegemonic role. And that requires the continuation of a good American security relationship with the smaller Gulf states and with Saudi Arabia.
Greg, I really appreciate you taking your time to be with us for this short conversation, and I want to give you the opportunity to raise any other topics you think we ought to cover before we conclude. Do you have anything else that's burning issues on your mind these days?
Well, Richard, you mentioned Iraq, which really is, I think, the long-term wild card here. I mean, as you mentioned, I just published this piece with the Brookings Doha Center on the stability of monarchy in the Arab Spring, and so I mean, I think the Gulf monarchies are here to stay for a while. Iranian politics is the future direction of Iranian politics can't be certain, but it does appear, at least now, to be shifting a bit back toward a more responsible foreign policy that wants to Iran that wants to be a regular actor in the politics of the region and the world. That doesn't mean we're going to agree with the Iranians on everything, but we can deal with Iran on a state-to-state basis if Iran is willing to deal with us and the other states, our friends in the Middle East, on a state-to-state basis. We can deal with them. The future of Iraq is up in the air. It remains a divided state, a weak state, right? A government that cannot pull together the disparate constituencies in the country in even some kind of least common denominator understanding of where Iraqi politics should go. And my fear is that as politics in Iraq continue to deteriorate, Iraq becomes, as it has been, although to a lesser extent recently, becomes yet another playing field in this new Middle East Cold War, and that it draws the Iranians, who are already there, even more in. It draws the Gulf states, who tried to affect politics in Iraq and basically failed, more in. It draws the Turks in, and that any prospect of an improved geopolitical situation with the governmental change in Iran will disappear. Not so much because of Syria, but because of Iraq, because of the increased involvement of all of these parties in what appears increasingly to be a return to civil war in Iraq.
Dr. Greg Gause from the University of Vermont and the Doha Brookings Center, as always, has been a great interpreter of events in the Gulf for us, and always adds a realistic and experienced and expert perspective. And I really appreciate the opportunity to have a chat with you. I hope we can do it again and continue to involve you with Hariri Center activities. I agree with you completely that we need to put a lot more focus on Iraq. That's something we plan to do here at the center over the next year, recognizing exactly the point that you made in your final remark there. Again, thank you very much for participating, and I look forward to continuing this dialogue at a future date.
It was my pleasure.